August 12th, 2011, the birth of what would soon become one of Magic's most loved and revered competitive formats going forward. And with 12 and a half years of history through the modern format and all the ups and all the downs and some of the tier 0 formats and some of the most diverse metagames that we've ever seen in just about any game or format, period, modern has created this mystique, like almost the ideal format for Magic and the ideal format for players to play, even with its rapidly aggressive evolving of archetypes and different strategies that have come about in the years since its inception in 2011. We're going to be taking a look today at one of the most polarizing of archetypes that have ever existed in the modern format, and weirdly balances the line between love and admiration from other players and disdain and disgust from others. So today we're going to be taking a look at Splinter Twin, giving some context for the format at the time, going over the deck, the general strategy, and ultimately why players kind of want it back and kind of the rep that it created for the modern format during that time. So without further ado, let's go ahead and let's take a look at Splinter Twin for the modern format. So here we are on MTG Top 8 to kind of give us a little history and kind of a look into what exactly was being played in the format. I mean, this is going to give percentages of like every deck that was played, and to an extent, you would see a lot of these decks, but of course, the top echelon of the meta game is what we're going to be looking at. So on the aggro side, you had Affinity, which basically played a bunch of free artifact creatures, and you tried to just fill up the board with all of these dorks, and then try to resolve an Arcbound Ravager or a Cranial Plating, and then you can just kill your opponent. Affinity, and to an extent, some of the other decks we'll get into, kind of like Urzatron was another one that was like really good in game ones. You had other combo decks like Storm, which was a good turn one or a good game one deck. You had Living End, who was a great game one deck. Dredge, another one. These types of decks played very, very well in game ones where your opponent was just trying to play some pretty decent cards. And essentially, if you weren't playing against like Jund, those combo decks had a very hard time dealing with you because you just get to the board really quickly and could essentially end the game over the course of like a few turns. Something that we're kind of used to in modern currently. But Affinity being the poster child for aggressive decks. Of course, you have Red Deck Wins, which was essentially like these like Boros burn decks and stuff that we know today, where you would just try to cast lightning bolts and lightning helixes and Boros charms and kill your opponent. You had these like blue red aggro decks. You had Jun, which was obviously the poster child for mid-range back in the day. Everybody played Jund, and even today, people still play Jund to kind of hang on to that like nostalgia of the fact that Jund decks back when they were legal and standard, and then when they came to modern, are just super powerful and just very good against a wide range of decks of the format, especially at the time where we're not nearly as efficient as a lot of the other cards that we see in the format in terms of creatures and removal. And the few creatures that we did get that were super efficient, we had like Tarmogoyfs, you had Dark Confidants in the Jund deck specifically. And you were even playing cards like Olivia Voldaren as well, and maybe even like Thragtusk too. They just managed to find their way into modern decks, which, for today's standards, if you saw someone playing Thragtusk, you would probably bang your head off the table having an aneurysm because Thragtusk is just not a card that you would see. And crazy enough, probably a card that ends up being like way better than you would expect it to in those situations. But you have your usual suspects even now, like Zoo was a very aggressive deck. You had the mono white martyr decks, or a hexproof deck, or Boggles as it's been known. Obzon aggro, and as we kind of go into the next era of modern at this time, you have a different deck besides Abzan. You have it kind of taking over the mid-range role, Rock being another mid-range deck, so on. Control, you have Urzatron, which is crazy. That's like in the control deck. It's basically a combo deck. Not nearly as efficient, and it's going to be a keyword that we're going to be using during this time. Not nearly as efficient. The threats in this deck now are just more of like big things that you can play on turn 3 and onward and just absolutely crush your opponent. So doing what Tron normally does now, just not having the big toolbox like it has with Karn the Great Creator. You have Scapeshift that's trying to put Valakuts into play and 6 other mountains to deal tons of damage to your opponent. Blue-white control, of course, a staple of the format. Blue-red control. You'd also see like some Grixis control, but there's only very few players that would play it. Fairies being a deck that we actually sort of kind of went over in another video. Same with the Jund decks here. But Fairies was a popular archetype in Standard, made its way to Modern, and had a decent showing. And Combo. Combo was very apparent in these decks, or in the decks available to us in 2014. Yeah, 2014. So you had Creature Toolbox, which was essentially Pod, who is the antagonist or the protagonist, depending on what side you fall on, where you would play cards like Birthing Pod, and you had just a chain of creatures, as it was called. So you would start your turns, hopefully playing like a Birds of Paradise on turn 1. That Birds would then help you cast a Birthing Pod on turn 2. And then from there, you could turn the birds into a 2-drop. And then you could also play still like a Kitchen Finks, and then you could sacrifice the Kitchen Finks to Birthing Pod, and then you get the Kitchen Finks back thanks to its ability, and then you can go get a 4-mana cost creature, and so on. And you would have these games where you would be able to get these toolboxy, like very niche creatures, but you were playing them at 1 copy, so you're able to go and get them, put them into play, and it would hose your opponent, and essentially play like this mid-range strategy that also had a combo finish to it, and could do it at a varying speed. Whether it needed to go fast, it definitely had the tools to find it and try to assemble it as quick as possible. It also didn't have to, because again, a lot of its toolbox creatures were really good just in games and could pretty much like halt any offensive that your opponent could have put up, any combo, like Blue Red Storm and Infect being notable ones and stuff like that. You could just kind of stop whatever offense that they would come up with, and could just basically have a tool for every job. And it was a very powerful deck, of course, getting 11% of the metagame. So that brings us to the protagonist of our story. We see like Affinity, red deck wins, have some pretty high percentages. Urzatron, Scapeshift, 65%. These 2 decks in particular have 21% of total deck list from like these major events. And we're looking at Twin Exarch, which is essentially Splinter Twin. The Twin Exarch archetype is pretty... The combo itself, once you get it established, is pretty simple, but in the way of doing it and how we get there is complicated. Where I think the pod decks are inherently complicated, having to remember what creatures are in your deck for, what other creatures that you have in play that you can go get to the right toolbox creature for the right time. And setting up the combos a little bit harder because you're looking for like 3 pieces, maybe even 4, to kind of set it up versus Twin Exarch having 2. So that's where we're going to start, and we're actually going to jump over to it's going to be the most recent list, but the list that ended up actually winning its last legal Modern Pro Tour, which actually we can set up by going to 2015. Where we would unfortunately see the end of our Birthing Pod, like Creature Toolbox deck. So, of note, to kind of set up the list that we're going to look at and the event, in 2015, at the end of 2015, we got a ban announcement for the Modern format, and it was pretty huge. Before, you had people that were able to play Treasure Cruise and Dig Through Time, which seemed kind of silly by today's standards, but like back then, it was very powerful. I think like Treasure Cruise got limited in Vintage, and I think it also got banned in Legacy, and then banned in Modern, along with Dig Through Time. And Dig Through Time, even now, like, just doesn't seem like it's as powerful as it was before. Definitely I remember casting Dig Through Time and just being like, this is one of the most busted things you can do. And even the same thing casting like a Treasure Cruise. But, going into, the end of 2015 into 2016, the biggest the biggest threat to the throne of the Twin Exarch Splinter Twin deck was the Creature Toolbox deck. And now that it's gone, you see decks like Infect kind of get a little bit of an uptick. Amulet Titan, notably, is going to be a big part of the next Pro Tour that is essentially going to be played, in just a few weeks after the ban list. So I believe in 2016, the ban list, the January ban list banned Birthing Pod, it banned Treasure Cruise, and it banned Dig Through Time. So we've just a few weeks before the modern Pro Tour for Pro Tour Fate Reforged. And Twin Exarch, head and shoulders, just seems like the clear cut one of the best decks to play. Of course, you still have Affinity. Affinity is still running around. Affinity is still very powerful and still just able to win game ones at an insane rate and then double back and just try to steal game 2 or game 3. Not sure opponent has like an insane draw both games. It was more than likely going to be able to take down and win at least one of those games. Yeah, Tron was still around. You had Scape Shift, Blue White mid range. These different control decks, Graceless Control. You had Gifts Ungiven, so you had like a Gifts control deck, and then eventually you would kind of get some of these other like Gifts Reanimator decks and things like that. And then, of course, going down like Amulet Titan, again, hold on to that. It's going to be a big player. You have Blue Red Storm, you have Ad Nauseum, the Dredge decks, Jeskai Ascendancy, and even the Elves archetype was pretty good, mainly focusing kind of on Twin and Amulet Titan, which we will definitely get to here in a moment, where we're going to go to 2016, where we have one of the major events that, of course, is not going to be brought up here. We're going to take a look at the last modern Pro Tour in which Splinter Twin was legal. We're going to go over the deck. We're going to explain what's going on, how it necessarily works, and exactly what made this deck so powerful, kind of in the context of the format, given kind of the rough overview of what we know is available to us in the format. So let's go ahead. Let's jump over to Anthony Del Moral Leon's Pro Tour winning list from February 8th of 2016. So I'm wrong. Of course, I got it wrong. February 8th, 2015, we played the finals of the Pro Tour. This is Splinter Twin. This is the final configuration of the deck, and really from 2015 to 2016, there has been little deviation. There's been some minor upgrades, some minor tweaks made to the deck to make it a little bit better to the metagame that we were going to see at the Pro Tour, which was now not going to have Birthing Pod in it anymore. So card by card, let's kind of explain the combo. So the main card in the deck is Splinter Twin. Crazy. Literally named after the deck. Or the card is, or the deck is named after the card. So it's a 4-mana aura. You enchant a creature, and the enchanted creature has tap, put a token that's a copy of this creature onto the battlefield. That token gains haste, exile it at the beginning of the next end step. Now you're thinking, wow, I could put this on, a really big creature, and then I can use it to block, and then I can attack with it, and so on and so forth. And you don't have to lose the physical creature, or maybe it has a powerful enter the battlefield trigger. It has a very powerful dies trigger, what have you. There's a lot of possibilities with Splinter Twin to make it broken, especially playing it in a commander format as well. Like Splinter Twin is insane with a lot of those big creatures that have those big splashy enter the battlefield when they die, leave, so on. But we're putting them on Pestermite and Deceiver Exarch. Now, the setup for this kind of deck and kind of the rep that it gave Modern was that on the end of your opponent's turn, on their turn 3, you have 3 mana up. You can flash in Pestermite, or you can flash in Deceiver Exarch. The Deceiver Exarch was a little bit harder to kill. Lightning Bolt was pretty popular, so Deceiver Exarch was definitely the preferred creature. But if your opponent had was playing like Soul Sisters or something like that, or could gain a life whenever a creature entered the battlefield, you needed Pestermite because its 2 power could outpace the 1 life it was going to gain. They were going to gain every time that you had a creature come into play. But these all kind of share the same sentiment in a way. So when they enter the battlefield, Pestermite says when it enters the battlefield, you may tap or untap target permanent. Deceiver Exarch, you choose one, untap a permanent you control, tap a permanent an opponent controls. So you couldn't end up actually like tapping your own permanents or untapping one of theirs. So there's like no confusion with this card. But essentially, the combo is you play this on turn 3, you maybe tap your opponent's land, maybe you untap one of your lands, whatever, and then you cast a Splinter Twin on the creature. You tap the creature to activate the ability that it just got from Splinter Twin, and you make a copy of Deceiver Exarch or Pestermite. You target the enchanted Exarch or Pestermite to untap it, and then you're able to tap it again, make another copy, and you make as many untapped copies of a creature that you want. You just flood the battlefield, you make roughly 20 quadrillion or whatever big number you want to come up with, whatever you got to do, and end up attacking your opponent for lethal. And this was essentially a turn 4 combo deck, or at least it was perceived as a turn 4 combo deck. And kind of like the misconception that I think a lot of combo decks get. Obviously, in the best case scenario, you play Exarch or Pestermite on turn 3, where your opponent like taps off for something that just doesn't matter. You put this into play, maybe you untap a land, whatever, and then you untap, play your 4th land, cast Splinter Twin, you win the game. All easy. But nothing is ever easy in the modern format. And even though that this was the most played deck, it was definitely the most popular. And even by like today's standards, I mean, we've had some tier 0 formats and we've had some formats, just even recently where it's not necessarily like the best deck in the format or the perceived best deck in the format just far outpaces the field. And even in like this day and age, this deck did not like outpace the field in terms of like metagame share, kind of like what we see from Rakdos Scam today, or Eldrazi Winter, or Hogak Summer, or any of those other. Even Death Shadow was a very like powerful and versatile deck, super efficient, super lean. After we had gotten some bannings, and still it didn't have nearly the metagame shares like some of those other decks. And same thing with Splinter Twin. So how come things didn't come easy for this deck? I mean, if it's considered the best deck or it's like one of the top 3 decks, I mean, it should have had a relatively easy time, trying to win, right? In a way, yes, and of course in others, no. So this deck in particular, the plan A, in a way, was to basically put yourself in a position to combo. You could cast like Deceiver, Exarchs, or Pestermites, tap your opponents out of mana, so they couldn't like necessarily Lightning Bolt or counter, playing like something like Spell Pierce to hit your Splinter Twin, or what have you. Or get to make counter wars a little bit easier for your opponent, where instead of having 2 mana, they have 1 mana, and then you're able to cast a Splinter Twin. They try to counter it, you counter back, and then the game is over. But like most blue-red decks, it just couldn't necessarily, like, it could combo on turn 4, but it didn't need to combo on turn 4. And you could just play like a very fancy burn deck. We see in like the spells, there's 4 Lightning Bolt here. There is 2 Electrolyze, and like really that's all you need. With 3 Snapcaster Mage, you could easily just burn your opponent out and play like this fair game where you're just playing at instant speed. You have like Vendilion Click to disrupt your opponent, take their best card out of their hand, or in a lot of cases, back in the day, the best Vendilion Click was when you looked at your opponent's hand after their draw step, and you just let them keep the cards because they more than likely weren't going to be able to beat whatever you had or do anything with the cards that are in hand if you just didn't give them a card. So like Click, Snapcaster Mage, Exarchs, and Pestermites, just when you're casting them at the end of your opponent's turn and you're getting to do it every turn and they're not forcing you to spend your mana on, say like Remand or Spell Snare or what have you, you can just get to the point in the game where your opponent has to deal with the board And then that opens up the door for either comboing to finish the game or just even casting lightning bolts and electrolyzes and snapcaster mages to just end the game. And really, that's where the power of the twin deck came from, and really what we see in a lot of modern decks nowadays, where plan A and plan B are both really good. And that's kind of what you need now. It's like the standard in the modern age of the modern format. But back in the day, like a lot of decks really didn't have like all that great of backup plans. I mean, you can argue that some of them did, but really, what we see from Twin is just kind of the thing that it's been doing. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. There was a major shakeup in the format, and it just did not care. You get to still play these one mana cantrips and the Serum Visions. You get to peak. You get to play Dispel, Flame Slash, spell snares, with some very powerful 2 mana cards in the format. Again, notably from like Tarmogoyf, Dark Confidant, and things like that. Even, the Snapcaster Mages were a very popular card. Remand was a very popular card. Just a lot of like tricks, and if you were playing against a really good twin player, they would find any and every way to just absolutely bleed you dry to make your cards as ineffective as possible. And again, not even in really like countering them. Like Remand, you would have these like Remand wars where you would cast a spell, then your opponent would Remand your spell, and then instead of remanding their Remand, you remand your own spell, because then they don't get to draw a card and you get to draw a card, and you still get to keep your spell around, which it was going to anyway, but your opponent's remand wasn't free then because there was nothing there for them to target, which means they did not get to draw a card. Pretty interesting, and this is a card too that we see, in the white version, of course, the name that escapes me, a little bit better, but like kind of pays homage to Remand, because this was just like the first card at the time that did that, and it was super good because of the fact that it drew a card. This deck wanted to hit its land drops. You wanted to be playing a land every turn. I mean, you were trying to get up to a Snapcaster Mage Cryptic Command, which Cryptic Command at the time was like one of the best cards that you can play, and arguably one of the first like 2-for-1s players really, really, really wanted, because like counter draw was really good. Tapping all of your opponent's creatures was very powerful, where you could kind of set up turns where your opponent maybe could get into a big attack to win, and you could start chaining cryptic commands together, getting in and attacking, and eventually the game is over. You're able to win when your opponent isn't able to enter their final combat step to win the game. Electrolyze was another one of those cards that, 1 and 2 toughness creatures were pretty important. So you could pick off 1 or 2 different creatures and get to draw a card as well, replacing the Electrolyze itself. Snapcaster Mage Electrolyze, even just getting hit to your opponent for 2 and drawing a card is a-okay with you, especially getting a 2-1 body as well to again kind of keep that pressure up. You have just all these different tools and different things that you can do that Twin just did better than everybody else. And, ultimately leading to Splinter Twin getting banned and never to be seen again in the modern format. And it's a very polarizing topic. It's a very polarizing card, because in reality, 4 mana I win the game cards have never went away. And we've seen a ton of them in the format, and a lot of them having just as big, if not a bigger metagame share than something like Splinter Twin. With the likes of Omnath, Locus of Creation, we have the One Ring, even as recent as the One Ring, as a 4 mana spell. And we've even had cheaper spells that have kind of took over the game, and up the beanstalk. We've had cards like Eye of Ugin, which enabled the way for, cheaper Eldrazi to be printed in the Oath of the Gatewatch, which then created Eldrazi Winter, as it is so delicately put, after Protorth Gatewatch. And this deck, I mean, let's be honest, is like pretty fair compared to something like Hogak, compared to something like Colorless Eldrazi or Blue-Red Eldrazi, even like the Grief, Undying decks, the Scam decks and stuff like that, the 4-color control decks, so on, in a format where we have tons of free spells nowadays. Twin doesn't seem that powerful. And Twin, don't get me wrong, I mean, it is a combo that just wins the game. You put it into play, your opponent can't interact with it, they win the game. And part of a reason why that was so too is that like Lightning Bolt was one of your best removal spells in the format. I believe Abrupt Decay at this point had like come out, so I mean you could interact with Exarch and Pestermite uncounterably with an Abrupt Decay and kind of hose your opponent too, because they were playing like this enchantment that, if you killed the creature, they essentially spent 4 mana to do nothing. Obviously, didn't matter to players because having a 4 mana like I win the game on the spot was definitely a high enough, payoff to offset the cost of the creature I put this on might die. And of note too, you had different variants of the Splinter Twin deck. Like you had Patrick Dickman, who played a like Teamer Twin list, and like always seemed to be playing Teamer Twin, and you play like Tarmogoyf and get access to sideboard cards, and even having a game where you put Splinter Twin on a Tarmogoyf and just got to beat down with like the token Tarmogoyf, putting it on a Snapcaster Mage, so then you essentially can like have like a draw new that's in play, except like you have a 2/1 that also can like block as well as getting to flashback a lightning bolt, maybe get like a peak or serum visions and whatnot. This deck was very versatile in what it does, and I could sing its praises all day because this was like the progenitor of the modern as a turn 4 format. We'd see cards like Birthing Pod, which was essentially 4 mana, but it was like cheaper. You could play it on like turn 2 with the help of a mana dork, and then from there you can kind of get chains going and whatnot. But at the end of the day, it was a 4 mana card that going unchecked wins the game. Just Splinter Twin did it immediately, where Pod would do it over the course of a turn or two. And really creating this mystique of the modern format where Legacy was known for doing some pretty busted things, for being pretty interactive, but doing busted things. And in Modern, you were doing busted things, and just the spells and the rate that they would go for to stop those busted things did not match up. So obviously, if with the removal that we have today, where you have like Solitudes, you used to have Fury, but like just having instant speed removal in Solitude, and having things like prismatic endings, and even to this day, getting to play like Leyline Binding. You have all this 0 and 1 mana interaction. Granted, these decks would as well, but their combo plays at sorcery speed, so they wouldn't even get to use the full effect of a force of negation to back up their spells and everything, and stop us from interacting with like their Deceiver, Exarch, or Pestermite, even when you're completely tapped out. And this isn't supposed to be a video preaching like if Twins should come back or not. That's honestly up to the players to decide, and then ultimately Wizards of the Coast to bring it back if they so choose to. But it's crazy how nowadays like 4 mana cards have to be so far above rate to see play in the hyper efficient and brutal format of Modern, and it has to do a lot. And Splinter Twin, even in the day and even nowadays, people want it. People want to play this card, and it's honestly understandable seeing it because it plays in a way that is super satisfying and super fun to play. Yeah, you have your turn 4 wins, but you also have games where you play super interactive and you're kind of nickel and diming your opponent. You're casting Lightning Bolt, hitting them in the face, and then you're playing Snapcaster Mage, casting Lightning Bolt in your opponent's face. You're playing Electrolyzes, hitting their creatures, getting to draw cards. You're getting to tap their team, draw a card. You're getting to put Splinter Twin on a Pestermite. Like you could even put it on a Vendilion Click if you wanted to. And Legend Rule the token, and then you can just look at your opponent's hand every turn, every draw step, and just kind of get that information from them. It's so much. There's so many layers to this, and I think from the in franchise players, Splinter Twin got the respect it deserves. It was a very powerful deck. It probably needed to go, but I also think from the like casual Modern player, and from somebody who may have like a lot of secondhand accounts or just a few secondhand accounts of kind of what Splinter Twin was, from some players that probably lost to a turn 4 Splinter Twin, got those players saying that Modern was like a turn 4 format. And while it certainly could be at times, I think if you had two players of like comparable skill level, or even just some high level players, that a lot of the time you would have these games that are grindy and interactive, and just kind of what you want Magic to be about is a grindy interaction. And really, like, in a way, Twin gave you that. It forced you to respect it. It forced you to play interaction in your deck, because you kind of got rewarded if your opponent tried to go for it too soon and it blew up in their face. And with the amount of decks that were just super aggressive in the format that could go underneath of Twin as well if it needed to, is pretty amazing that this card got banned in the first place. Maybe for the time, in all honesty, it was probably too good. But, years later, I think it becomes increasingly more okay. And of course, I think I've made my philosophy pretty known on cards that should be banned and cards that are not banned in that. Uh, but ultimately, it is not my choice. And unfortunately, for a lot of modern players, again, like, this was one of the best decks to be playing at the time. It unfortunately ends up getting banned along with the card Summer Bloom, which we see in the Amulet Titan deck played by Justin Cohen, who lost in the finals to Splinter Twin. I believe this is like a sweep. It was either like 3-0 in Del Moraleone's favor or like 3-1. Either way, like, it was just an absolute brutalizing beating. And of course, we saw this card Summer Bloom get banned because of all the different combos it facilitated in getting to play like 2 amulets and then playing a bounce land, play Summer Bloom. You're just playing Titans and pacting for more Titans and getting to just kill your opponent and deal upwards of like 32 damage on like turn 2. But like, this is like the deck that people look towards and think about when they talk about, the mid 2010s era of modern, where we get towards the end, where we get, something like the Death Shadow decks and things like that. We had Twin. We had some very powerful combo decks in the format. And honestly, this was definitely a fun era to play in and get to kind of learn about and kind of get a little nostalgic over. And watching old Pro Tours and Grand Prix and IQs and stuff like that, you definitely didn't see Twin as much as you would expect to from how people talk about it. And honestly, maybe one day we'll get this card back. And then the players who have been asking for it to be unbanned, universally unbanned, where we finally got something like Stoneforge Mystic back, they want their Splinter Twin. And obviously, like, this card has divided the community in if it should come back, why should it be legal in the first place? Even if it isn't good enough anymore, like, why do we want it back? Like, why does it matter? And I think it's just a difference of philosophy and what you think is a fun format, what makes the game fun, and so on. And ultimately, there's probably a pretty good chance that Splinter Twin just never gets unbanned. And that could happen. And you could still play a deck like this, supplementing Kiki Jiki for Splinter Twin, for an extra red mana. But, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. It could happen, could not happen, but we have the memories of, 2014 and 2015, where this deck was, quintessential in like its battles with Pod, in its battles with Affinity, with Amulet Titan, with Infect, with all these other iconic archetypes that we've seen in the format. And honestly, some of them that we haven't seen in like a high number in quite a while. And just coming out on top of all of it, getting to dodge one ban in, the same list that Pod got hit and some of its other cards got hit. It persevered and then won the frickin' Pro Tour. It's amazing. And honestly, I'm happy that I got to share kind of this little journey in, going back in history and looking at one of the most popular decks, or at least one of the most polarizing cards in one of the most popular decks in the format, and going over some other big hitters of the format. I look forward to doing this more as we kind of go back into the history of Modern, maybe getting to go a little bit more in depth than I would necessarily went in this video. and maybe even starting like from the beginning of the modern format, because we have a lot of history, almost 13 years coming into 2024, which is absolutely insane for a format that we alluded to earlier in the beginning is probably one of the most popular competitive formats in Magic right now, and easily one of the most tested and played formats by casual competitive players, and even like the highest echelon of competitive players as well. Featured on like the Apex Gaming Invitational Tour, and was a mainstay in like the Star City Games circuit, and even now you see a decent amount of it in like their big open events, and one of the biggest showings in like the modern, in the Pro Tour era that we've entered, where it's like the most viewed event. It's insane. This format's awesome, and I look forward to taking this journey with all of you again soon. That's gonna do it for me. I hope you all enjoyed the video. I'll see you all in the next one.